All right, so mixing plaster. Pottery number one plaster is is mixed at a ratio by weight, okay? And it is usually weighed 70 parts water to 100 parts plaster. So in other words, if you had 100 grams of plaster, you would need to add, or you'd need to start off with 70 grams of water, okay? That's a very complicated ratio. You don't have scales. So we are going to give you a few different volume equivalents, right? That you can use to mix. However, there is a technique that is used in foundries and in industry for mixing small batches of material. Oftentimes plaster is industrially mixed, so they will mix an entire bag or multiple entire bags, and so weighing it out is the best way to do it. But when you're mixing small batches, there's a technique that is often referred to as the island technique. And I'm just gonna really quickly explain it to you, and then we'll show it to you. So you always wanna kind of start with like no more than half of a bucket of water or whatever the container you're using, because you don't want it to fill up too much. So let's just start out here with, let's pretend this is your water level, okay? So with plaster, you always start with water and you add the plaster into the water, okay? You never put water into dry plaster. That will be a disaster. So this technique, you start off with the water and you load the plaster in it. And you sift, as I'm going to demonstrate, you sift the plaster into it. And the plaster is stone, it's very heavy, and it settles at the bottom. And it sinks to the bottom, and it keeps sifting. You try and sift it around the whole bucket, and it's building up, it's displacing the water. And it's kind of like at the mouth of a river or something, or when a lake is drawing up, there's a point at which the silt and the particles in the material displace all of the water. And what happens is you start to get like a little bit of an island that forms on the surface. So when that island starts to form, and you have to kind of pay attention to what you're doing. This is kind of a feel thing, right? It's not, because sometimes you're sifting a plaster in there and a big clump falls in and it kind of floats on the surface for a little bit, but it actually settles and sinks. So you need to pay attention to like, when you use this technique, kind of how much material you're loading in there, and you can kind of tell when it won't go down anymore. And you can also see, like when it won't go down anymore, you'll sometimes see that the water is like leaching up the side of the island. Now, it doesn't have to be like this amazing island, this huge volcanic island. It can just be, like a little bit of material on the surface. You can kind of tell when it will no longer sink into the water. Once it's in there, you want this to sit for like a minute. Do not mix it, okay? And then, let it sit for a minute, let it absorb the water into the molecule of the gypsum, and then you have to mix it really vigorously, okay? You don't want to whip tons of bubbles into it, but you want to make sure that it's mixed. You want to mix it for a good minute and a half or so, and really make sure it's nice and creamy and mixed well. So anyways, you can use a calibrated container and use this ratio for small batches. But I would like you to get used to kind of using the island technique. It's a feel thing. The more you do it, the more you understand. So over here, I've got 6 ounces of water and 10 ounces of powder. Now, if I press the powder down into the container, it's going to be compressed and it's not going to work. So I've kind of very lightly kind of poured the plaster and sifted it in there so that it's not compressed. All right, so remember with, pardon my reach. So remember, with plaster, you always start with the water, okay? So that's 6 ounces of water is in there. And now I'm going to take my powder and I'm going to start the process of slowly sifting it into the container. Let me rotate this so you can see it through the opening. Okay, so oftentimes you're sifting this right from the bag. So you might be using your hand to sift it in. Since I'm kind of using a container, it's a little bit harder to control where the plaster ends up. Okay, so now you can kind of see that the powder is kind of on the surface. It's not going down anymore. It's kind of sticking above, and the water is kind of wicking up the island. I tried to kind of distribute the plaster around the outside, but it's a little bit heavier in the center, which is why there is an island. So I'm gonna let that sit for a minute, and then I'm gonna use my hand and kind of mix it together for about a minute. Okay, I'm gonna just get started with the mixing process. And I'm keeping my hand under the surface of the plaster and mixing, and I'm trying to kind of make sure that I'm scraping kind of the corners of the container. Now I'm gonna keep mixing, even though it seems like it's fully mixed. I want to mix, and for probably a full minute is a good amount. A lot of people kind of undermix their plaster and it separates. So there'll be like a pool of water on top. Okay, so now I'm gonna pull my hand out, and you see how creamy that is? It should really look like a very heavy cream or almost like a pancake batter. If it looks like milk or low-fat milk, where it just is, you could see right through it and it's not creamy like that, then it's too thin. That means you put too little plaster in it, not enough plaster, okay? So I'm gonna just mix this a little bit more. And it's pretty much ready. So now I can go ahead and pour this into one of my forms. So pottery plaster has kind of a very slow kind of process of its pot life is stretched out. So it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and it gels, and then it is very workable for a period of time. So that's one of the benefits of this plaster, also is that you can kind of shape it and form it as it's setting up. So I will be kind of discussing that in one of the other videos. But that is mixing plaster.